Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much for being here for hold on. Wait a minute, my laptop's not working. Hold on. There we go. Thank you so much for being here for the Nature-Based Solutions for a Changing Urban Environment. My name is Brenda Richardson. I'm with the Anacostia Parks and Community Collaborative. Our other sponsors include Capital Nature, the Trust for Public Land, City Wildlife, and of course, MKSK. We have a wonderful speaker today, Joe Chambers, who's the principal and sustainability leader for MKSK, Landscape Architects and Urban Designers. He is a fabulous young man who is doing some amazing things in the district on many forests. And they did this fabulous park day for us, which is how my interest was piqued. And we're just so delighted that all of you are here and delighted that Joe is here. But I'm going to turn this over to Stella. Stella is the head of Capital Nature, and Stella has been doing some remarkable things in this city as well. So we're so happy that all of us were able to collaborate on this effort to bring this wonderful Zoom educational webinar to all of you. I'll turn it over to Stella. Thank you.
Brenda, thanks so much. And Joe, a special welcome from us. And we're particularly excited to have you here because Kelly, who is here, Kelly Collins-Troy from KC Trees, and actually quite a number of the folks on this call are part of the BlueGreen Resilience Corridors Working Group, which is a project of Capital Nature, and nature-based solutions are at the core of what we're talking about. We think we should fill our city with nature so that we are healthier, and also nature as really a response to climate change. And that's not to say we also don't need to find the best practices to make sure that our natural systems survive during a time of increased stress from climate change. So healthy people, healthy nature. So I'm actually just going to turn it over to you. I'll come back to facilitate the discussion. And just to note, this is an in-depth meeting. It's actually 90 minutes. So hold on to your seats. The first 45 to 60 will be from Joe and also Maya, who will be introduced a bit later. And then we'll have 30 minutes for discussion. So keep your questions, put them in chat. We'd love to hear from you during the slideshow and then definitely during the discussion. So Joe, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Such nice things, including Brenda calling me young. I thought that was very sweet. I'm Joe Chambers with MKSK. Before I start the slides, let me just ask, how many people are still freaking out that the world is going to end, the human race is going to end, and that climate change is going to do us in? I mean, it is still a concern. Things are going to get very hairy. I think we can all agree on that. But an interesting thing, I often say this just in case there are younger people on these talks and everything, because in the last couple of years, a lot has changed with solar and wind coming in so heavily and becoming now cheaper 6 months out of 12 last year, cheaper than oil or coal for producing electricity. The politics are starting to change worldwide. And if anything, the United States, Canada, Australia, and the oil countries in the Middle East are going to be in danger of being sort of islanded in the petroleum use sector, while other people move on to cheaper renewables. So interesting changes afoot that are going to really bring things down. 8 degrees Celsius was always the terrifying number that came out from the IPCC. Folks are not really talking about that as a likelihood anymore. Now we're really afraid of 4 degrees Celsius rise, and we're really shooting for about less than 3, as close to 2 as we can get it, which is going to be crazy, but it's going to be much more manageable and not the same terrifying reality that we were looking at a few years ago. I like to say that because things have changed. People, I think, were very hopeless a few years ago. And as we like to say in our firm, find a place where you can put your two hands and push. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Okay, is everyone seeing the slides pretty normally, full screen and everything?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yes, I'm Joe Chambers. I'm a landscape architect. I'm the lead sustainability person for our firm. Firm is MKSK, another firm with a bunch of letters as an acronym for the name. I tell people to think mi casa, su casa. It's the easy way to remember it. We've got 12 offices going from up into Chicago and Detroit down into Atlanta and Orlando. 125 folks, and we do land planning, landscape architecture, and urban design work. This is Columbus, which is our home office. This is the science center and the park that surrounds it. So we do sort of integrated work, natural systems, landscape architecture, and buildings. So I always like to start every talk about climate change. One of the things that we've tried to do is we tried to frame the issues that we're talking about with sort of where the impacts are coming from, what they're doing to us, and what changes we can make, how that fits into the bigger picture. So I always like to start with saying, the big thing that's happening right now is what happens to a lot of species. We have been very successful. There are a lot of us, and our numbers are going up exponentially. It took us 100,000, 200,000 years to get to where we had 1 billion people, which happened in about 1802, 1803. And since then, in the last 200 plus a little bit years, we've gone up another 7 billion plus people. So we're on that steep a right now, starting to level off. And interestingly enough, the thing that is going to bring population to a stopping point and actually have it starting to decline is better public health and assurance that people are going to have kids and they're not going to lose them in childhood. So a certain sort of secure feeling in knowing that you're going to have kids and that they're going to survive you, and women's education. When women have control over their own finances and so forth, it creates a sort of a more stable society and so forth. So these are things that are happening rapidly in the wealthier parts of the world, in North America and Europe and places like that. And places like that are starting to experience declines in population, but it's starting to even out. The thing to do is to, as quickly as possible, get public health and education to the least advantaged parts of the world. So we like to frame this discussion by looking at the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is a cycle that is as old as, well, at least as old as about 2 billion years ago. For the last 90 billion, 80 billion years, 80 million years since the age of the dinosaurs, there have been 3 cycles that have been going fairly steadily, keeping the world in balance. It's as if there's a sort of a thermostat that keeps the temperature more or less in check. So the atmosphere is the really fluid part of that carbon cycle. Stores about 200 gigatons of carbon, or it did historically, up in there, mostly in the form of carbon dioxide. The terrasphere, that's all of the living stuff. So that's the plants and the animals and the soil and so forth, stores an enormous amount of carbon, about 3,000 in the soil, plus all of the fossil fuels and things that are underground that have not been exploited so far. And then in the living tissues and so forth, and what we see on the surface, there over, historically, we're over 8 gigatons of carbon. The land itself stores an enormous amount, but that's not even worth calculating it so much. Even though the land itself is a small part of the surface of the earth, it's really the ocean, and especially the deep ocean, that stores the most carbon. And that's because it's more than 3/4 of the surface of the planet. So cycle number one, the geologic cycle, is really just carbon dioxide being pulled out of the atmosphere when rock weathers. So as rock weathers, it pulls in carbon dioxide. Those particles run down into rivers. The rivers run down into the ocean, where they fall to the bottom. Eventually what happens, because the ocean plates are heavier than the land plates, you have something called subduction, where the ocean plate gets jammed in underneath the land plate. And that's why we have mountain ranges tend to be at the edges of continents and things. And you have volcanoes and other geysers and things like that that eke carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere. So this is the small one, it's the slow one, and it's the very steady and dependable one. The really active one historically has been all of the living tissues. So basically what that is photosynthesis pulling a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide down into living tissues. And then about half of that coming back up into the atmosphere in the form of decomposition and respiration. So and fire. As plants decompose and compost, they release their carbon dioxide. Same is true with the soil. And those things, as big as those numbers are, tended to stay in balance, just like the geologic cycle. And historically, the ocean cycle was the same. A lot of carbon dioxide was absorbed into the surface of the ocean. Some of it was used by animals and so forth. And then a similar amount of it was released, and that stayed in balance. Okay, so here's all of the craziness that's happened. The atmosphere is now loaded up with an additional 50% more, so up to about 3,000 gigatons instead of 2,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Okay, most of that is coming from fossil fuel emissions, which run these days up at about 40 gigatons a year. The decomposition and respiration and the photosynthesis are still basically keeping each other in balance. The fossil fuel is an emission that's on top of that. And one of the things that's happened is that so much of the vegetated surface of the earth has been changed over to other uses, into mostly farmland, but also urban areas and things like that. And so our pool of living tissue for exchanging carbon dioxide atmosphere into living tissue has been reduced by about a third. The ocean, in the meanwhile, is running an overdrive. It's still managing to absorb and release almost in balance, tremendous amount of carbon dioxide, but it is picking some up every year. And it's been the place where we could absorb going all the way back to the beginning of industrialization. So we've got 150 years of absorption there, and that's why we're seeing acidification of the ocean so much. The tremendous increase that we've seen in the atmosphere has really mostly been over the last 50 years or so, and that's because of the tremendous increase in population, housing, transportation, and so forth. So, and here is the pants on fire emergency. We need to come down, according to the IPCC, by 2030, we've got a deadline there in yellow, to cut our carbon emissions from 40 gigatons a year to 20. And then by 2050, our next deadline, to get down to net zero. Some of that is going to need to happen with sequestration, and that's something that I'll get into in a minute. You can see how just over these next 25 years, starting at 40 and going down to as close to zero as we can get, we're still looking at putting another 600 plus gigatons of carbon up into the atmosphere. So that's getting to be up close to about 2/3 of what the excess is now. So the faster we can make this happen, the better. And that's the big thing that needs to go on. Interesting thing, sort of counterintuitive, is that cities are a really efficient way for people to live on the land in terms of the impact to natural systems. This is a great study that was done in Berkeley about 15 years ago called Cool Climates, a variation on some mapping that had been done before at a much coarser scale. This goes through and zip code by zip code says what the carbon footprint is for every area. And it gives these little charts for each one. If you hover over the zip code, it'll tell you how much was transportation, how much was in housing, food, et cetera, et cetera. And the great thing about this map, like a lot of really great analytical maps, is that it shows you a pattern and it tells a story, right? So I think of this as the sort of carpet bombing or meteor crater kind of map. Every city has a green, which is the lowest carbon footprint spot in the middle. And then it goes out to this yellow color through orange all the way up to red. So the X suburbs, the outer suburbs, are the heaviest carbon users. And then it slides back down. So you can go up the coast here and you can see Richmond, DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, all the way on up there, these little green spots. A lot of people have asked why the Midwest is so red. When we printed this 5 years ago, there's still a lot of coal being used for electricity generation out there. Similar study done about Halifax by University of Ontario, I believe, showing that services and utilities are about double in the suburbs from what they are in cities. And it's just surprising, you know, things like water, easy to understand how that could be about 3 times, going on 4 times as much as in the city, just because houses are farther apart. So if you're going to run pipe, there's a lot more there and everything. But school busing, that makes sense. Police, sure. But some of these things, like just straight up like governance and libraries and things like that, are still all double. So very interesting study. Really great study actually to read. So a lot of LEED's planning points are taken from this assumption that you know, urban living is more efficient. This is the project that we worked on. You might know Katie's Alley in Georgetown, where Cafe Leopold is. The alley in the center of the block became the focus of the open space, and then new retail, housing, and office was opened throughout the block. So here's that center space running down the middle in red. All of these dark spots, those are all infill sites. And so basically for the same utilities that are already hooked up to here, the same public transport that was already in existence, and much of the same architectural infrastructure, this block was able to double or triple its occupancy. Same number of people living on a footprint that was just increased slightly during construction because of these improvements. So this is the kind of thing at the city planning scale is just great to keep in mind, that all of those folks could have been living spread out through the suburbs, and that's a whole other environmental problem. And just a reminder that it's like, you know, really great urban space. That's what it's what gives identity to neighborhoods and makes living life in the city so enjoyable. And so, you know, beautiful spaces are just really an important part of the formula. Okay, I'm going to go through some bad news on the biodiversity and climate change thing, and then we're going to talk about some solutions. So one of the reasons why, or the big reason really, that land has contributed so much, the changes in land have contributed so much, is agriculture. This is just looking at 1000 BC here, the very small areas that were farmed, and then flipping over to present day map, how we've really gone from tiny spots of farming with mostly undisturbed land to mostly farmed with some leftover places that are undisturbed. Looking at this chart here from our world in data from Oxford University, which is the world's best rabbit hole, if you like statistics. The forested part of the world has been converted, about a third of it has been converted, mostly to crops, but also to urban land. And a lot of the wild shrub and grasslands have been converted over to grazing. Most of the impact in crops, though, has happened in the last 100 or 150 years. And that's a trend that's continuing despite a lot of innovation in agriculture. So all of the things about, use of, better treatment of the soil and so forth, and more efficient agriculture, very important in the sort of bigger picture. But urban land is growing really quickly. The rural population in the world stopped growing in and around 1960 or so, and the urban population is absorbing all of the rest of the population growth. So tiny little slice of the habitable part of the world is urban, and but a really, really big slice of the population. So we're housing lots and lots of people on a small footprint, but that footprint is growing rapidly. Folks are talking about, by the time population tops out around 2100, that we're looking at 2 or 3 times as much urban space. So managing that urban space is going to be more and more of an issue and have more and more of an impact. And the big problem with urban space isn't so much the compact areas in the center of cities. It has a lot to do with the sprawl around the edges. And the particular issue is fragmentation, where you have small bits of open space that are engulfed by development, and the sort of separation of living spaces that are unconnected with each other. Look at these little islands of green space that are left over here that are barely connected to each other. I mean, that's the problem with suburban development. Okay, so this is getting down to the bad news. Cornell University ornithology did this tremendous study finding that bird populations declined by about 30% between 1970 and 2010 or 2015. So in other words, bird populations are falling somewhere between 0.5% and 1% per year, and have been since 1970 or so. It's uneven. Interestingly enough, wetland species are doing well. I think that has everything to do with the Water Protection Act. And it looks like the grasslands are the ones that are being hit really hard. I don't know this for sure, but I would bet that that has to do with more chemical, more mechanical agriculture and the disappearance of hedgerows and other natural areas. Okay, and then the worst of the news is the insects. Insect populations are declining even more rapidly. And these are the creatures that do so much of the work in our natural systems. These are our burrowers that aerate the soil, the pollinators. They have their own circles of predation and complex things going on. So referred to these as the small things that run the world. Who am I thinking of? The entomologist. Oh, well, it'll come to me in a moment.
E.O. Wilson.
Wilson.
Thank you. I knew somebody was going to shout that out. Thanks very much. Okay, sense of proportion here in terms of biomass around on our planet. Plants are more than 80% of the total biomass. Remember that this is a big reduction from what we had in pre-industrial times. Bacteria is another enormous slice, so another 12.5%. And that leaves all of us, animal and all of the other microbe species together in this last sort of 5% or so. Fungi and all the other microbes occupying a space. Animals are less than 0.5%, and then we're here down at about 1/100%. So looking at that, most of the animals are out in the ocean. This is the fish and the shellfish and that sort of thing. At this point in time, humans at more than 8 billion have risen way up in the ranking here. There are 3 times as many livestock fowl in the world than there are wild birds, and there are 15 times as many livestock mammals in the world than there are wild mammals, just to give you a sense of proportion and how much of the world we have impacted. And if you map the, granted at a very different scale, but you map the decline of insects here in blue and the decline of birds in this sort of pink line against our population curve, their population curves are reciprocally falling as ours rises. So, what's really needed here is a much more efficient way for us to live so that we have a lighter touch and leave more space for all the other species. Okay, now we get to some solutions and some good news. Absolutely critical, underlying all of the thinking in management of ecosystems is really, I guess, Richard Foreman is the most important mover and shaker in this world. But a way of thinking about how configuration and size matters in the management of ecosystems. Basically, this is known as landscape ecology, and it identifies some parts and pieces that you can think of as having particular, adding particular strengths to ecosystems. Large areas, large patches are especially beneficial because that interior space, the darker green here, gives habitat to a lot more species, and a lot of species that are now having a tough time because, as I mentioned about the fragmentation around the edges of cities, when you have lots of small pieces, this lighter green color is edge. That edge habitat is really different from the interior, and it hosts different species. So what happens, here's fragmentation, as you break that up, your interior space becomes smaller and smaller, and your edge space becomes a larger and larger percentage. So what's happening is that as if we're taking the total value of the landscape, and by cutting it up into little pieces, we're handing most of it over to some generalists and a lot of them great species, but they're edge species. They're in a minority. And so we're vastly reducing the center safer spaces for all those other species. Large reservoirs are good. So the more you can protect big areas, they're known as reservoirs, that's a benefit. And the other thing is that if you can make corridors that connect them together, those corridors make it so that species that are in center spaces can either move through that or hop and skip between islands in between, but they can get from one to the other. That's especially beneficial because species that are isolated in an area like this face that extinction down curve that happens when you have fewer breeding options. So, if you're down to just, 3 or 4 foxes in one reservoir area like that, that population could well disappear. Whereas if they can swap places and get to other reservoir spaces, that's a big benefit. If you think about the way that land is managed in cities, there are sort of 2 systems that we see the most of. On the left here, what you see is a map that was generated by the Media Lab at MIT. This is 1 green pixel per street tree in Washington, D.C. So you'll see Rock Creek, because it's public park and has no street trees really, except on the through avenues, is a sort of a white spot. And so are the 2 rivers, are the sort of, open spaces and so forth. I find this really interesting because the map gets so much darker up in Northwest. And that line between light and dark is essentially the line between the coastal plain and the Piedmont. It's almost the same line. And essentially the reason for that is because if maybe you work downtown in the center around the government area, if you had a lot of money, you could move up to the cool, breezy hills of Tenleytown and buy yourself a great big spread where there were wider streets and in the end, healthier street trees. So there's an interesting geologic, cultural, economic, social map here that's made just in this analytical map showing street trees. But I mean, this is the blanket that makes greenness that covers the whole city, right? So we go to the other, and this was from the SWAP map, which is the State Wildlife Action Plan, which is a report that needs to be prepared by every state across the country in order to access federal monies for environmental programs. DC has the only all urban SWAP map, which I just find this really fascinating, was prepared last round in 2050 by Damien Ossie, who probably a bunch of you know, was a really wonderful guy. And I think this is a brilliant piece of work. This is an overlay that shows a number of different factors, things like hydrology, variety of species, I think deer browse, things like that. But there are about 10 overlay maps here. And so what pops up in the green and the blue are the more diverse, stronger habitats, and towards the red end of the spectrum are the lower, least habitat value areas. And essentially what you get here, classic to the way cities are developed, is the least developable parts, these are either the high areas or the swampy areas, were left for last. And by that time, people would say, oh, it would be really great to have a park here. Let's take over that swampy place and make that into a park. Unfortunately, early in the 20th century, still filling in those swampy areas. But in any case, we end up with these parks that are leftover areas, and then these are protected and preserved because they're owned by municipality, or in our case, mostly National Park Service. DC, because of this corridor kind of configuration, Rock Creek and the other parks and things, and then the forts around and through Southwest, is for its size the most diverse wildlife in terms of wildlife city in the US. So an interesting thing. Our firm, though, we look a lot at the center area and around town and up along this Route 50 and industrial corridor up through here, and think, what can we do to these areas to start to make some corridors that cut across here, that start to make this connective. This is also where most of the people live, right? In these center areas. Here's Capitol Hill, here's Columbia Heights, here's Georgetown. It's like, can we make these beneficial areas start to creep in, and the benefits that these green areas give, can we give those to the denser parts of the city? Okay, a few things about the mechanics of natural systems. Biodiversity, most people think of like, snow leopards and endangered tigers and things like that. It isn't just about extinction. Biodiversity is the need to have diverse sets of species all living together in the same place. So, we can look at this picture and say, lovely meadow, which it is, but to an ecologist's eyes, what this is a very biodiverse community. This is a community of plants that do well in droughty years, plants that do well in wet years, plants that grow up fast and then die down, and other plants that wait and do well in sort of mixed sun shade and then grow up late in the season. Their timing, their weather, their temperature, moisture, all of those things and everything. But when you have a diverse community like this, the community as a whole thrives and protects each other and does better as a whole. We like to say a deep bench of players. And then there's Doug Tallamy's work. For those of you that know his work, This is the Doug Tallamy poster child, the Carolina chickadee. The study that Tallamy did out of University of Delaware with his group had an ornithologist. Tallamy was the entomologist, and then horticultural botanical people looking at what insects were being eaten by which birds, and then which plants were hosting those insects. So the Carolina chickadee is mostly an insectivore, and like a lot of birds, the period when they build their nests and feed their youngs is a critical point in their life cycle. Two parents of a nest need to make, I believe the figure is 7,000 to 9,000 successful forays to find food over a period of 6 weeks while the hatchlings are in the nest. That adds up to one successful trip every 5 to 10 minutes for 6 weeks straight for about 12 to 14 hours a day. So an incredible feat. If they're going to trees that aren't hosting insects, then they're not finding food. And according to the work of Desiree Narango, who was here in DC doing her work as a postdoc for Smithsonian, she came up with the number 70%. 70% of the plants are native, 70% or more, and the chicks tend to live. 70% or less, and the chicks tend to die. And that's because plants and insects have a very hand-in-glove kind of relationship. And if the plants that feed the insects aren't around, then there's no food. It becomes a sort of a food desert. So Tallamy and his lab ranked species of plants, oaks hosting the most in this area, going all the way down to ginkgos. Ginkgos host about 2 or 3 species, and oaks host about 500 plus species. So we're talking order of magnitude times order of magnitude increase from the top to the bottom. Ginkgos are great trees. They're excellent in next to busy roads because they are great at absorbing pollution from car exhaust. But just something to bear in mind is that we now have this tool where we can judge habitat value of individual species. And then my favorite, Suzanne Simard's wonderful work on forests, finding how plants are essentially talking to each other through the fungal networks underground. It was known for years that fungus hooks into the roots of plants, and that they work together symbiotically, fungus and plants. The fungus are great at growing their little threads through the soil and pulling in nutrients. Plants are really specialists in making sugar. So essentially the plants were, feeding the fungus, and the fungus was bringing the nutrients to the plants. What Simard discovered was that they were using the network to communicate and exchange sugar to each other underground. So a needled tree might grow up and be making plenty of sugar at the end of the winter going into the spring, when a tree with no leaves, a deciduous tree, was really, in famine. The needled tree would pass sugar underground through the fungal network to the deciduous tree. And then when the deciduous tree grew its leaves and started to produce sugar and shade out the needled tree, it would send sugar back. So there are all of these kinds of exchanges going on underground. Simard and her students have been working on this now for about 15 or 20 years and finding amazing things, like that the individual seeds that are the actual biological offspring of a plant get favored amounts of sugar and nutrients from the parent over those that were actually from seeds from another individual. Same species, but basically plants have children. Plants that are injured get special treatment. They get nursed by other plants. Plants that are browsed or damaged. All kinds of things going on like that. When older trees die, they give up their sugar in through the network to other plants to help them grow up and grow into the hole in the canopy. Anyway, The conclusion that we came to from this is that plants that live in communities that work well with each other, that evolved this way, have mutualities that make them stronger as a whole. And so we've been working at planting, looking at communities. Here's an example of this. This is if you all were stuck in traffic and along on 295 over the last couple of years. We apologize for that. But we were part of this highway reconstruction. This is the access road to the St. Elizabeth's campus, about 1.5 miles. And we were asked to design the planting all along one edge up in next to there's Shepherd's Parkway and the forest that's in along next to that. We did an extensive microclimatic analysis and looked at things like soil conditions and hydrology, sun reflection, all of this sort of thing. And we broke the site up into these separate sections. And then we matched each microclimate to a different natural community. So for example, in along here in these detention basins, you'd have very sandy, fast draining soil because that's what you need to have for bioretention areas. But getting a lot of sun reflection, getting a lot of wind, getting salt spray in the wintertime sounds a little bit like a beach dune community. So we would take plants from the beach dune community and use those as the backbone. And then we worked with Xerces Society, who was that's a wonderful lab, and they're wonderful consultants to help us maximize benefit with the pollinators that worked with this community. So this diagram is just showing you how the plants are related to, various insects, and then those are connected to various birds and things. Okay, one quick thing, and then I think I'm starting to run low on time, but about health and planting in urban spaces. It's been known for a long time that plants reduce heat, they filter pollution, they lower stress, they do all kinds of great things. Recent study from about 10 or 15 years ago in Finland started to look at the relationship between environmental microbiomes and the human microbiome. So when I talk about the microbiome, I'm talking about that whole community of microbes that live in your body. Every person is a walking ecosystem. If you took a census of all the cells in your body, you would come in second. Your own cells would probably be, depending on your weight, your height, male, female, all those sort of things, but it's in the range of about 40 to 50% U cells and about 50 to 60% other cells of microbes. Now the microbes are much smaller, so that only constitutes about 5 to 10% of your total mass, and most of that is in your gut. The thing is that you get those microbes from the environment. You start with none just before you're born. You get a tremendous amount of them at birth, and then through your lifetime, you pick up an ever-changing community of microbes in your body. You get these through contact with the environment, and as it turns out, your ability of your immune system to recognize intruders versus your own tissue comes from lots and lots of practice. It comes from having a real diversity of microbes land on your skin, and it is particularly your skin. Interestingly enough, your lungs and your gut, which are the other two big interfaces, those are temperature controlled, those are climate controlled environments, and your skin is the biggest organ in your body, and it's just hanging out there with all kinds of stuff, things that you touch, dust that lands on you, et cetera, et cetera. So you learn through your skin, and if you're in a place where you don't get that access, your body doesn't learn that, and your immune system starts to turn against you and create what are known as autoimmune diseases. And those are things like asthma, certain kinds of diabetes, Crohn's disease, eczema, things like that. So in our modern existence, the typical American spends 7% of their time out of doors and 93% of their time in a car or in an indoor space. So you look at a place like the island of Manhattan in New York, and the total interior space, the real estate space of indoors, is 3 times as large as the total island. So what's been happening over the last 50 plus years is that we've been conquering all of the good old diseases. Those have all been going away with medical discoveries. And in the meantime, because we're having less and less access to the environment, we're getting more and more autoimmune diseases, and it is becoming epidemic at this point. Most of these come from the soil and from plants, because each plant species has its own typical microbiome and its own soil microbiome that's associated with it. So if you want diversity, you plant a diversity of plants. And that's what the studies in Finland showed. In Finland, they ran a 10-year protocol of having kids, instead of immunizing them against allergies, having them actually go out of their way to have contact with things that they were allergic to, and getting kids outside more. There's a really amazing study done about 5 years ago by the same group for the next generation of folks that made the initial discovery, where they took a number of the bacteria that they knew were associated with lower autoimmune diseases, and they mixed them into play sand in daycare and into planting soil that the kids were using for projects. Jury is still out. It's too soon to know what that's going to do to autoimmune diseases. But interestingly enough, sinusitis, strep throat, and a couple of other things dropped off really precipitously once the kids had contact with that stuff. This is a project that we did up on H Street. This is the Apollo. Down on the ground floor, facing on the other side of the building, that's where the Whole Foods is, and Solid State Books is down in under here somewhere. But we worked on this really amazing developer, Insight Design, had this idea that nobody should be farther than a couple of stairways away from an open space that they could access. So all these little courtyards, and then this really extensive roof up on the full of greenery up on the top, easy for folks to access. A lot of these units have balconies, and they all have operable windows, which means that you can keep your windows open at night and breathe in those positive microbes. And that's one of the courtyards in the building. Okay, I think I'm getting down towards the end here. I was going to talk a little bit about soil, but I want to make sure that I get on to other stuff.
So you actually have almost another 7 or 8 minutes, so I think you're good.
Okay, well, I want to get on to the mini forest and leave Maya some time to correct my misperceptions about mini forests, because they're the ones, they've planted more than half a dozen of these up in New England now, and they're spreading out. We're hoping that we'll get to do one with them somewhere in DC soon. Really quickly about the soil, think of the soil as being like a series of meshes that are all different sizes. The most coarse one is sand, and that lets roots grow between it. The medium-sized one is just a smaller version of sand, and that's silt, and that lets fungal threads grow through it. That's how fine grained it is. And then there's clay that really sort of builds up. It's like a mineral accretion that makes these very sticky, platey little particles that are microscopic. And only microorganisms can live in between those. So you get this diversity based on the size and the scale. And soil is about half solid, which is little tiny pieces of rock. And then the other half is water and air, and that switches back and forth all the time, depending on the rain and the et cetera, et cetera. And about 5% of the total here is dead organic matter. It's the critters that move everything up and down, that make the holes that allow the drainage and so forth. It's the mycorrhiza that reach out and pull the nutrients into the plants I like to explain soil as the place where plants outsource their digestion. So we're animals, right? We need a lot of energy. So because we chase after our food, and because we're moving around all the time, we have a hole that runs right through us, and we have a sac in the middle where we catch all of our food, and then we outsource the digestion of that to the microbes that live inside of us. Plants have this amazing ability to reach up into the air. So they put tons of energy into building this scaffolding so they can put out all of their photovoltaic cells. And up in there, that's where they make all of their sugars and starches. That's basically where their bread and pasta comes from. But their feet go down into the soil where there's this very, very complicated, incredibly massive surface area because of all of the tiny particles. And the little, the microorganisms that live in there have this relationship where the plants exude sugars out through their roots, and the microbes are attracted to that. They feed on it, they make their own community, and they do the digesting that the plants need to survive. So the other half of their food source comes from here. A really interesting product, which is new, but it's not new, is biochar. This is basically toasted organic matter. It's toasted to the point where it's pretty much all just pure carbon. Unlike sand, here are two different sand particles. This is a calcareous one and a silica one. This one much smoother because it's a harder surface. But look at how incredibly complex the surface of the biochar is. That's because when you burn the biochar, it burns down to where it leaves just the cell walls in a skeleton of carbon. And that creates all these nooks and crannies that since it is negatively charged and a lot of the nutrients are positively charged and water can go both ways, it attracts water and nutrients, but doesn't hold on to it so tightly that plants can't pull it away. So what it is it's a nutrient and water stabilizer that you can add to the ground. It's not new because it was discovered about 3,000 years ago. The interesting thing is that it's pure carbon, you bury it in the ground, and it'll last for a couple of thousand years. It was discovered in the Amazon, layers of it having been put down 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. It's also been used in Southeast Asia with burning rice husks and things like that. But it's one of those practices that we can get into. For those of you, this is just talking about street trees really briefly. A really wonderful project done by Richard Burke Associates in Boston on Broad Street was to cast holes through the concrete slab in pavements so that water could get down into soil vaults that are underneath the pavement. Richard Burke, he studied industrial design, and he invented this brick that's actually a grate, and they lay the bricks across the concrete pavement, and every time they come to a hole, they just use a grate brick instead of a regular brick. And so that's made this very well irrigated system. There's another system that we're looking into now with talking with Casey Trees, actually talking with Mark about this, about trying to use a modified version of the Stockholm tree pit so that we can get water into the structural soils that are under the pavement and mix biochar into that structural soil to give it more nutrient retaining quality. Okay, two that we're exploring, and I'm gonna have to speed through this. We're looking at a number of different kinds of landscapes that are essentially landscape restorations or much more carbon rich, much more habitat rich landscapes to put in cities. One is the meadow. Okay, so meadows are essentially big blankets of soil, generally fairly thin, although that depends, but they're limited by some factor that keeps woody plants from growing on them successfully. So you have like an alpine meadow where the combination of the wind and the sun exposure and so forth, and the thin soils, because the soils will run off of mountains, even in valleys like this. So you have a thin soil here that grows a great diversity of species. or you have a coastal meadow where the salt spray and thin soils, keep the woody plants from growing. The prairie, as you go farther west in North America, and you have things like this in the Pampas in South America and the steppes of Central Asia. These are deep soiled systems where there's very little rainfall. So the limiting factor here is rain. And these sequester monster amounts of carbon and have fascinatingly diverse and rich underground ecosystems happening because they have to grow their roots down so deep in order to get water. We've planted a number of these out in the plain states. Urban meadows, and here it's like this small one here is a real labor of love because it's work to maintain a meadow. Meadows are really derived from sort of very lightly used animal pastures, but they do host all kinds of wildlife, pollinators, and so forth. But I put this tractor here just to remind you that the limiting factor needs to be us. We need to mow these. And the trick to running a successful meadow is mowing it at the right time to keep the woodies from growing up. Okay, I'm going to talk for just a minute about mini forests. This is an amazing practice that was developed by this man, Akira Miyawaki, starting back in the 1970s. It is a way of doing forest restoration, but with a twist that makes it extra, like many times more dynamic than a regular forest. It's essentially it's an accelerated kind of forest. And the way that that's done is by deep digging a bed for the forest before planting, and then planting trees at about 4 times the density that you would in a normal forest restoration, which is about 10 times the density that you'd find it in a normal, healthy, mature forest stand. And you deep dig the beds, and you ultra enrich them with compost and compost tea and things like this. What happens is the plants are only about 18 inches apart. These are mostly tree seedlings and some small shrubs and things. They've got no place to grow out, so they grow down. And as they grow down, they find a lot of moisture and a lot of nutrients, and so they grow up fast. These are forests that grow at about 4 to 5 feet per year. And because they're so dense and so close together, no light gets to the forest floor after about the 2nd year, and that means no maintenance at all. You get an incredible yield of carbon right away, which I think probably crests. There's a lot of attrition in these forests as the trees die from competition. This is a little bit like sowing your radish seeds really close together and then pulling a few of them out, except that in here it's just attrition, the trees dying, falling to the forest floor, and then providing nutrients for the other trees. Because you're growing things basically like right off of the starting gun so quickly, you can choose any trees you want. So you don't go with the pioneer species, you go with the climax species. So the oaks and the hickories and things like this. Those are the higher carbon sequestering trees. And it means that you can essentially skip over the whole pioneer process and go directly to climax forest from the get-go. Their heat island cooling impact is immediate and very profound. The habitat that they protect is much more like an interior habitat, and so gets rid of some of the edge problems that we have. They can be planted in very small areas, as small as about 800 square feet, about the size of 4 parking spaces, which means that you can use them for all kinds of things in urban areas because you can fit them and move them around in different places. They have very high values for all of those co-benefits. So pollution remediation, stormwater absorption, all of that sort of thing. They're used to protect from dune migration. from tsunami surge in Japan, as windbreaks and things like that in India. So it is a remarkable tool, and it is really just coming to the United States. It's been very popular in Europe. People have been doing it quite a bit for the last couple of decades or so. But it's folks like Maya's group up in Cambridge that have really taken it on. They look a hot, wet mess for the first couple of years. They're all over the place. They need to be fenced and everything. But the thing is that they grow so quickly that that's a phase that's over pretty quickly. You have to like not plant where you want to have paths, because these are so dense that you can't even move through them. Because there's so many seedlings, and the seedlings are very small. You can see these kids here planting this tiny little seedling. It's a planting that's easily done by really anyone, but there's lots and lots and lots and lots of seedlings to plant. So the best way to do it is with a public planting day. And these planting days are traditionally sort of done as a kind of celebration day. So big barbecue, games and things like that. So, and a really great way for the community to know you've participated in this, and this is how many, the exhaust from this many cars has been offset. This much has been done to help with the climate crisis. This is how much habitat you're creating for other species. Oh, and then, well, one other quick thing here. Rebecca McMacken, Brooklyn Bridge Park. She has done tremendous work with maintenance, which is the forgotten and, sort of less sexy kind of climate solution, but in a lot of ways, one of the most effective. So this is about leaving plants where they fall, tree limbs and things like that, leaving seed pods and tassels and things like that for birds to eat in the wintertime. And interestingly enough, training your staff up to recognize weeds, to get involved in a decision-making process. So there are interesting education equity issues in this, where you take a staff and you train them up to a higher level of knowledge and understanding and involvement in the landscape. So instead of having just people pushing mowers at Brooklyn Bridge Park, they're training people to do things like recognize the difference between invasive praying mantis, chrysalis, and the native, so that the staff can go and pick off the ones that are going to do damage, and they're having amazing results there. So last word. Oh, I almost here. I'll fix this slide as I do this. Oops. So, around cities, whoops, that's not going to work. Okay. Around cities, you have all of these places where lawn is just the default landscape, because it's so easy to push a mower around. It's a very quantifiable, knowable, predictable kind of landscape treatment, right? But we refer to these as wonder bread landscapes because they basically have no nutritional value. Wouldn't it be great if you could go through the city and, okay, there are a lot of places where you can't plant, like here is where Pennsylvania Avenue crosses over the Anacostia River. There are underpasses here and there are view lines that are important. But what if you planted meadow in the center area where you see orange, and you planted the rest of this in forests and so forth? You could up the total biomass in cities by about, we figure about 20 to 25%. So we've started to talk to people about this idea of 50% canopy coverage by 2050. It's a kind of a moonshot, but it's something that we're just starting to talk to folks about. Okay, so Maya is the really knowledgeable one about the mini forests. I will roll back here to my slides, and I'm just going to let Maya talk about this a little bit. Maya, you have any comments?
Great, thanks, Joe. What a comprehensive presentation. So I won't get into too much detail here, but I just want to emphasize a couple of things in what you've shared. One, the idea that we're really planting, these communities of vegetation, of native trees. You can, as you said, you sort of pick and choose, but within the methodology, the idea is to recreate the natural forest ecosystem of the area. So that involves, a pretty detailed kind of species survey of what belongs here, what is traditionally grown here, what is appropriate, good for, of course, the biodiversity, the pollinators and infiltrators and all of that, as well as kind of what will establish that kind of climax forest ecosystem. The second part I want to share a little bit about is the kind of soil remediation, the preparation of that. As mentioned, we kind of dig deeply down to about 1 meter or about 3 feet. And the idea is not to excavate that soil, get rid of it, import new soil. Sometimes people have questions about that. That would be a very intensive and prohibitive process. But the idea is to kind of mix this decompacted soil, loosen it up a bit, and mix in amendments that are bringing some of that nutritional value, kind of jumpstarting the microbial and fungal life that is so essential to a living forest floor. And to increase kind of the perforation, water retention, all of these really important processes for kind of the cycles that make this forest grow quickly and also self-sustain in the long term. And really the key here that kind of Miyawaki was innovating on is what can we learn from the natural forest ecosystem, from the ecological succession that would take place without any stewardship, and where can humans, act as those stewards to kind of jumpstart the process and increase the amount of complexity, diversity, and really self-sustenance that brings that resilience forward in a shorter period of time than if we kind of left it alone, and certainly then if we continued our degrading kind of activities. So I think that's kind of an essential part here is, the way that we're able to make an innovation is by being intelligent about what the ecosystem wants to do, and working kind of within those constraints, and within that kind of that pattern. The other thing I do want to emphasize too, you shared a little bit about the planting day as this kind of celebration and this way for community to get involved. And these really are community forests. They were pioneered that way by Miyawaki as a way for people to kind of take part. And they're also, really wonderful kind of living classrooms, especially in urban areas where we have so much disconnect from our ecosystems and a pretty low degree of kind of ecological literacy and recognition of our native species. Certainly a growing kind of appetite to take positive climate action. This is a great way for students to start to learn about natural ecosystems, about stewardship, about ways that they can kind of get involved in solutions, and receive some of those kind of positive benefits that, Joe, you were talking about earlier in terms of access to nature, to microbes, but also to some of those kind of physical and mental health benefits. There are studies on the ways that this can improve focus and behavior and lower kind of crime rate statistics. And so I think thinking a little bit too about the social and communal aspects of what these forests bring to our cities is really huge, as well as kind of what they do for wildlife, for connectivity, for processing stormwater, improving soil health, reducing erosion, buffering against floods and droughts. It's really that kind of multiplier effect of benefits. And the last thing I'll share, because I know we want to get to Q&A, is that kind of small size of the Miyawaki forest, 800 to really 1,000 square feet, being the idea of kind of the minimum size for creating a microclimate that will kind of retain its water, its moisture, and cycle efficiently. that really means that we can deploy these strategically in our cities, and in particular, kind of combat the environmental injustice that really affects marginalized communities, in terms of kind of the concentration of heat and pollution that is resulting from, all of the redlining and kind of historical impacts that are built into so many of our cities across the country and across the world. So, I think this is a great tool in the toolbox for, again, increasing those kind of multiple benefits and really starting to implement natural infrastructure a little bit more. So yeah, those are my kind of 5 cents to add in, and happy to share more, but I want to turn it over to the group because I know we've got limited time. And I'll share my info and Bio for Climate as well, where you can find some more resources on this.
Maya and I were talking about, if you think of adding green to the city and sort of corridors as like a Scrabble game and you're racking up points, the mini forests are sort of like a Q on triple the letter score. It's just a super high scoring environment.
So thank you, Maya. Thank you both. And I think let's go back to gallery view. And as many of you as would like, I'd love to see your faces. So please let us see you if you can. Great. So let's jump into Q&A, and we'll go ahead and converse until 2:30. So I actually have a Washington-based question for you, Joe. So you actually live in DC, you know DC, and you work internationally. So what are some places where you think we could start looking at Miyawaki forests or mini forests in DC? Like, have you seen some favorite sites that you're like, oh, if only DPR or that private landowner would want to, this would make a great place for a mini forest?
Yes, actively looking. We've been talking with a group about the possibility of planting a mini forest at a school. I think that there's funding for that, and there's certainly a lot of interest at DOEE. I think we're pretty close to making that happen. Brandon and I have talked about doing some extensive planting in some of the housing communities. So, when you're home, you're at your place of residence more hours a day than any other place. So if you want a place for people to get the maximum benefit from planting. So we've talked about the possibility of improving the planting at some of the housing communities, especially Ward 7, Ward 8, just as a place where, to test the idea that you could improve public health with planting and using some of the methods and so forth that they've been looking at in Scandinavia and Finland. So yes, actively looking for places.
Joe, that's great. And actually, for those of us that are in the discussion now, if you have any ideas for sites, please put them in the chat. If we don't have a chance to hear from you, I'm really curious, dying to hear where all of us have seen places where these mini forests and fecund landscapes could emerge. So, I think from hearing your presentation, and Brenda, I saw you perking up there in chat too, it's like that great information on biomes for children's health. I love it when science confirms what our parents and grandparents told us when we were kids. Get outside and run. Go and just play outside. Doesn't matter what you do, just be outside. So I think the research, and you're suggesting that 10-minute rule isn't enough. You know how we talk about every resident should be within a 10-minute walk of a park. I think that needs revision. What do you think that should look like?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Joe. I'm sorry.
So Brenda and I have been talking with these folks at NC State, a group called the Public Science Lab. A really good read, a book called Never Home Alone by a guy named Rob Dunn. He runs the Public Science Lab. It's mapping the microbiome of your home. And it's a remarkable book, and it goes into this. Yeah, I'm sorry, Brenda, you go ahead.
I'm also actually curious, Brenda's thoughts on that, because you're the one getting all those kids outside into the park and seeing the results.
Well, the reason I'm so eager to do this with Joe is because I'm very, very mindful, as you are, Stella, of the trauma that our kids are exposed to in public housing. And nature-based trauma-informed programming in parks has been the best thing that we could have ever done. And as I was telling Joe and Stella, I've talked to you about this many times, when we go into public housing, we find more brown space than we find green space. And what I mean by that is dirt. So I think that these mini forests could do a lot to enhance our well-being, both mentally, physically, and spiritually. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you. And please feel free to jump in anytime. You know, we had a number of comments. I'm going to need to be a little selective. I hope you all can bear with me on the chat comments. But, you know, we've had a number of comments about trees and the fact that DC is planting so many trees, whether it's Urban Forestry Division or KC Trees or private landowners. But I often think that when we use the phrase, we have to plant more trees for climate resilience, that that's really not enough. Like, it's not just about planting trees. I think it's part of a richer, more nuanced approach that involves pollinators and soil and all of those things. So, Joe, how do you think we need to revise our climate mitigation and resilience statement, the one that says we just need to plant more trees?
The only thing I'd say is that, you know, even though the city is homogenized to a certain degree with the amount of building, I mean, there's such a big human footprint in the city, and the city is made to sort of work to the way that we need it to be. The land is very changed, but there's still land everywhere in the city underneath where we are. And it's just a matter of finding what those spaces want to be. I mean, in that final slide, I showed a big meadow because that goes with keeping that view open and everything. Could be really beautiful to come to the end of Pennsylvania Avenue, look out over the Anacostia and see a big wildflower meadow at the end of it. Sort of a nice punctuation at the end. Much better than lawn, you know. So there's an example of, you know, meadow in the center and woods off to the edge to sort of bracket it and everything. There's a little bit of design thinking, a little bit of sort of going with what works there. A lot of those spaces where I drew that orange meadow was because it was on top of the overpasses. And so we're talking thin soils, and that meadow might work really well out there. So there are lots of things to do, all kinds of restoration landscapes that can be worked into urban space. Wetlands, shrublands, some quick turnaround for us where you know that there's going to be developments in a certain amount of time, things that could be harvested for biochar or for compost or something like that, or to be used in construction, you know, which would embody it over a really long period of time. So many different possibilities. It's a matter of the city embracing a sort of a toolkit of opportunities. Trees are the sort of big carbon, you know, hogs that really help with that. But all of these landscapes have different advantages, and you know, the carbon is really it's the very timely piece, and it's the emergency piece that I think is good to look at now. But it's really all the co-benefits. It's the public health. It's the restoration of landscapes. It's the putting of nature in close to people, you know. So embrace that varied kit, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, I'll just jump in and share, because some people are also talking about kind of maintenance and survival rates too. You know, in all of these different types of landscapes, biodiversity really increases the resilience of the restoration that you're doing, because they are inhabiting, you know, these different species have their niche, can trade those nutrients, can trade those water. And so overall, you're more resilient to kind of weather extremes, disease, pests, et cetera. So I think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, as you're looking at the urban forest of your standalone trees and that tree canopy and your possible kind of forest communities, you're really looking at the biodiversity for that kind of extra robustness.
One of my favorite places are the tree boxes in our neighborhood that are pretty cement-like. And there's so much that all of the neighbors and the civic associations can do. I'm going to turn to Kelly Collins-Choi. Kelly, are you available?
Yes, I still.
Wonderful. Kelly, I'm wondering if you have any feedback kind of from, I know you guys are thinking about the conservation easements, and I'd love KCH's perspective on this. And then when you answer that, if you could please look in the chat and maybe bring out a couple of questions that I haven't seen yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just monitoring the chat. Yeah, this was fascinating. Thank you. We've been working on finding ways to preserve pocket parks and other ecologically significant areas within the city through conservation easements, as well as preservation, and also looking at obviously opportunities for mini forests. So would love to chat with you more down the line, but I do want to give folks that put stuff in the chat a chance to get some answers. And I think, Maya, you might have answered a couple of these already, but in case people aren't looking at the chat, there were a couple questions specific to the mini forests about what qualifies as a mini forest, how long do they last, how well do they resist invasives, and then are there any kind of water-friendly or flood-resistant versions?
Yeah, all great questions. So starting with kind of what qualifies as a mini forest, we tend to look at the Miyawaki method, or this methodology that Akira Miyawaki developed for kind of picking a site, surveying the soil, the species that do well there, picking a kind of biodiverse but indigenous plant community, and to kind of take these steps of, one, being very intentional in what you're selecting, preparing the soil in order to kind of create that living forest floor, planting densely and maintaining for those first couple of years, after which we're letting that natural ecosystem self-sustain. So it's really kind of the adherence to that method and the kind of biodiversity and density parts of that. There isn't like, oh, you need 25 species to start with, but generally looking at a range of kind of biodiverse native species, and also looking at picking species from the various kind of vertical layers of the forest. So as Joe mentioned, there's kind of shrubs in there, and then also kind of mid-size sub-tree, tree and canopy levels, just to make sure that we kind of have, nature wastes no space whatsoever. So we're really trying to kind of make use of everything to input that complexity to the system and really jumpstart that ecosystem. So certainly some of the basic requirements are just kind of using native species, using just natural methodology, no herbicides, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers. We are trying to foster the living ecosystem. And so we need kind of our microbes and our fungi to do that, rather than, these other artificial methodologies that we've tended to use in other places. So that's kind of what the mini forest is and how it's done. In terms of the kind of longevity, these are designed to last forever, to become self-sustaining ecosystems that continue to develop both in kind of size, but also in their complexity. So the idea is, if you create a space that is actually habitat for, native birds and animals, they will come in and kind of with them bring those other seeds. New seedlings will develop both kind of from the trees that you've planted and from those natural processes. And that will kind of over time continue to develop and continue to cycle through in the way that nature does maintain itself. And it's sort of up to the stewards of the urban ecosystem to say, how far do you want to let that go? If there's an adjacent lot, do you want to let the mini forest get bigger? And I think the kind of limiting factors there happen to be us and what we want for our built environments. So no, they're not replanted after the fact. There is quite a lot of initial planting, and additional planting isn't required unless, you know, some intense vandalism or something comes up as kind of an outlying event. Am I missing a question there? General kind of minimum size, I tend to say 1,000 square feet, just to kind of develop that microclimate, and a minimum kind of narrowness of like 13 to 14 feet. So you're not creating these very, very small strips, because again, that kind of inhibits the amount of, you know, cycling and complexity that's able to develop. Yeah,
Maya, maybe
I missed a
that'll-
question there.
That I think that'll do us on
Great.
that question. I'm wondering if we could get maybe one more in, Kelly, before, I know Brendan also wants to do closing remarks, so I want to give him a chance to do that. There was an interesting one on wetlands. Maybe we could touch that one. So, you know, there was some conversation about wetlands, and I think it's a really interesting question. Kind of like, what do you do if you have wetlands in your backyard, and also vernal pools, which, you know, may not be glamorous at all. So I don't know if someone wants to address that for about 1 minute, kind of respond to the wetland question. What happens if you have a potential wetland or vernal pool in your backyard or in a park? Joe?
Yeah.
1 minute opportunity. Yes.
I mean, wetlands are, you know, were actively destroyed for agriculture and to create dry space to walk and things like that. Traditionally sort of an enemy of development. So a lot of wetlands were sort of eaten up. They are one of the most productive and diverse environments, you know, at all. And they're real serious engines for both diversity and for biomass. So I think, you know, get to know them. I worked on a really wonderful mass Audubon kindergarten with a vernal pool in next to the kindergarten, and we designed a deck on helical piers to go over that. Amazing place for teaching the kids salamanders and frogs and all kinds of plants that you don't see anywhere else and that have become rare because so many wetlands have been destroyed. Learn to know them and love them. That's what I'd say.
I love it. Let's see more of that across the district. And I know we had some really interesting comments and more questions in the chat. We'll definitely look at them and try to continue talking to you, even if we couldn't do it now. Brenda, I think sadly we're running out of time, and I wonder if this is the moment to give Brendan a chance to close.
Yes, thank you. Brendan?
Yeah, thanks, Stella. Well, only quickly, I think it feels like you've just gotten the ball rolling with this conversation. So excited to continue the conversation. I'm just pleased to maybe do some thank yous to Brenda and Stella and Anne for this collaborative, you know, effort, and especially Joe, also Ainsley from MKSK for the presentation, which really was fascinating. And Maya, thank you for joining in. The only thing I think to wrap up, you know, is to reiterate the comments from Brenda and Stella at the beginning, that it's critically important that we really push for this deep green, you know, infusion into communities. And it's a focus that we all share. It's not just the nature, but it's that connection of nature. TPL, our motto is connecting everyone to the outdoors, which often people think of, oh, I'll go for a walk or recreation. But today you just saw so many deeper layers: mental health, physical health, connection to the microbiome. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think when you look at the other part of the chat of people starting to pop up ways to do this, where to do a meadow, where to do a pocket forest, it's all over the city. So the potential is just amazingly large, and I'm excited to engage an ongoing conversation. Thanks everyone for joining.